For those of you who aren't familiar with Home of Virginia, our roots are in fair housing. We started 1971 as a fair housing enforcement agency right after the Fair Housing Act of 1968 was signed to combat discrimination in the housing industry. And since then, we've evolved in several ways. We run the City of Richmond's eviction diversion program. We also have a Center for Home Ownership Education where we offer down payment assistance for first-time home buyers and as well as education, in addition to a foreclosure prevention program. And then obviously our Fair Housing Shop, where we investigate instances of housing discrimination on the basis of protected classes such as race, color, gender, sex, national origin. In Virginia, elderliness, sexual orientation and gender identity, and as of last July 1, source of funds, a source of income protections. And then the Research and Policy Shop is really kind of linking the historic and systemic impacts of housing discrimination to a lot of the housing inequities and inequalities that we see today. And that'll be a large part of my presentation and conversation with you all today. And then from a policy perspective, really working on a state, regional, and local level to help create access to more housing opportunities. So a 35-person organization, but a lot of things. And so I'm really excited to lead this conversation today. I'll be sharing my screen in a little bit. The hope is that I'll talk for maybe about 35 minutes, and then it's a small group. So I would really love to open it up to have a conversation with you all and to learn about you and the intersections you all see with housing and the work that you're doing in your respective fields in the community as well. So Logan, do I have, yes, I think I can share my screen. Yep, here we go. All right. Sure. Can you all see that okay? Okay, perfect. So housing policy, residential segregation, and its impact on our region's most vulnerable populations. So I think, we can spend lots of time talking about this. I think there are so many, angles to discuss the importance of housing and to think about really the discriminatory impacts of housing policies. And so my hope is to kind of go through, different pieces of policy and legislation, and then really talk about, why does it matter? Why does where we live matter? When we are talking about housing segregation, why does it even matter? And so I'll do a brief review of some federal, state, and local housing policies that were essentially used to perpetuate discrimination and segregation in housing. I'll talk about the impacts of residential segregation, housing stability and what it looks like throughout the Richmond region, and then we'll end, wrapping up. And again, I would love to take some questions from you all. So when we think about the importance of housing, I think I often ask you to think about the neighborhood and the community that you grew up in, right? Wherever that was before you came to Richmond, think about the things in your community and neighborhood that you had access to, the types of schools you had access to. Were you near public transit, or did your family have the luxury or privilege of owning private transportation and having a car? What job opportunities existed in your communities? Was your neighborhood relatively stable? Did you have access to healthcare? Were there hospitals close to your community? Was there access to mainstream credit? So were there payday lending locations, or were there more traditional financial institutions, right? And this is certainly not comprehensive, but I share this as a way to kind of highlight how integral where we live is to all of these things that we eventually know end up impacting our lives as adults, and specifically how these types of environment shape the outcome of children. And so I want you to keep these things in mind as we're talking about how insidious kind of housing discrimination and policies have been, and really, perpetuating the inequities that we see in our neighborhoods. So why is this important when we think about where we live and why it matters? In Virginia specifically, 1 out of every 2.2 people live in an intensely segregated community. 1 out of every 3.5 African Americans live in an intensely segregated African American community, and 1 out of every 1.6 white person lives in an intensely segregated community. And because of the way our systems are designed, because of how structural inequities work, we know that where we live and the neighborhoods that we live in often go toward funding toward the public services and toward the amenities that really, kind of shape the I guess the investments in our communities. And so when we talk about why it's important to combat residential segregation, there really are kind of some tangible reasons for doing that, right? When we look at, and I want to say, I think that I believe that there are ways to break this down, right? I think that when we're talking about segregation and integration, we tend to use those as kind of it's one or the other. And I think if we looked at the history of segregation and integration in this country, there are nuances. There are nuances to that. So I just want to, make that statement before kind of talking about residential segregation. So what we see in combating residential segregation, which is the rates in which, individuals from kind of different backgrounds, different races, in this case, live in separate neighborhoods, is we see school segregation fall. We see that public schools are, for example, not only more integrated, but they actually grow relative to the private school sphere. So again, kind of eliminating that socioeconomic stratification that we often see in schools today. Crime levels decline. The racial polarization of voting declines. And in general, there tends to be more investments in public goods. And of course, we can argue, well, it shouldn't matter where we live. All of these things should be happening. And so once we transition into the kind of the historical piece, we'll start to understand how our neighborhoods have literally been become the blueprint for where investment goes and where disinvestment goes. So how do we get here? So I don't know if many of you are from Richmond or kind of where you come, but when we're thinking about, the inequalities that exist in the city of Richmond, or really, cities throughout the country, we have to start with looking at the intentional policies that were created to create these circumstances. And I'll be starting from about the 1930s. But one thing that is important to highlight is that these types of discriminatory policies were happening well before the 1930s. And in fact, post-Reconstruction, with the emancipation of African Americans, we can also speak to policies that were put in place to dismantle economic structures, limit access to home ownership, wealth building in communities as well. But I'll start with specifically looking at the development of the Federal Housing Administration in the 1930s, which for those of you who own homes may have an FHA loan. I'll talk about the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which was an institution that we now know was responsible for redlining. In addition to the Wagner-Steagall Act of 1937, which essentially was the legislation that created public housing, along with urban renewal, Brown v. Board, and then I'll end talking about the Federal Highway Act of 1956. So starting in the 1930s, on the heels of the Great Depression, the country was really struggling, right? The economy was tanking, the unemployment rate was really high, about 25%. And, the country needed a way to re-stimulate the economy, to reboost the economy. The reports, research shows that by 1933, 40 to 50% of all home mortgages were in default, right? So people were unemployed, they were behind on their mortgages. And so the housing industry really became the way to stimulate the economy. Everything from the construction of new homes, everything from the standing up of an employment industry to support the building of housing, all the way up to the federal level, standing up of what would become known as the Federal Housing Administration. So the Federal Housing Administration was created as an entity to ensure mortgage loans made by banks. And one of the important things to understand is that in 1934, FHA was stood up, and as a part of being stood up and kind of built into the lending policies around the FHA was, racist policies to perpetuate and to limit housing opportunities for African Americans and for other people of color. So much so that, this language is pulled from kind of looking at the policies of FHA. If a neighborhood is to retain stability, it is necessary that property shall continue to be occupied by the same social and racial classes. So here you have a federal authority, a federal administration being stood up, and embedded in the culture, embedded in the lending policies is this language that essentially perpetuates segregation on the basis of race, right? And so extremely problematic because, other programs start to be rolled out under kind of being guided by this policy as well. And so an example of this in terms of kind of moving forward a little bit, 1954, what does this look like on the ground? Some of you may be familiar with Levittown. That was one of the first kind of suburbs built in the United States. And, what essentially, what happened with Levittown and what the Federal Housing Administration did is that they would only guarantee bank loans for the construction and the development on the condition that no homes be sold to African Americans, and that every home have in its deed prohibiting resale to African Americans, right? So again, a policy that was literally on the books by a federal administration in this country. So also as a part of the FHA, there was something called the Homeowners Loan Corporation. They were stood up in about 1933, end of 1933, and the purpose of HOLC was to refinance home mortgages that were in default in order to prevent foreclosure, as well as to kind of expand general housing opportunities. And so they would extend, as a way to help families from going into foreclosure, they would extend repayment periods to about 30 years. The work of HOLC was huge, right? They were credited with saving 1 million homes from being foreclosed on. They are also the institution that is credited with institutionalizing something called redlining. And that was through the creation and the implementation of something called residential security maps. And when I show this map, maybe it'll be of surprise to some of you, maybe not so much, because this is kind of becomes the story time after time. But essentially what they did is that they would grade neighborhoods based on the worthiness of those neighborhoods to get loans backed by the FHA. If they graded you A, those were hotspots. Those were places where, you were good to go with getting a mortgage, 100% backing from FHA. If you were B, not as desirable, but, if you were likely to get a home loan there. C, signified, if you were graded C, that neighborhood had started to experience a transition. And so you were less likely to get a loan that was backed by FHA. And D, that meant, which was coded red on these residential security maps, that meant that the neighborhood had fully declined and it was characterized by detrimental influence in a pronounced degree. AKA there were African Americans that lived in that community. And so therefore, these were the communities that were redlined and essentially shut off and shut out of gaining access to housing opportunity. So this is a residential security map from the city of Richmond that was created in the 1930s. And when I start to talk about, the real material, how this impacted the material conditions of individuals today, and do a side by side, we'll start to understand that the same communities that were redlined back in the 1930s are the same communities where we see the highest rates of poverty, are the same communities that are food deserts, are the same communities where our schools are under-resourced, and are the same communities where we have the highest rates of people of color, right? And so this map really becomes the blueprint for further development and investment and or disinvestment in certain communities. This is a map, this is another version of the redlining map that shows that the neighborhoods that were redlined were also the neighborhoods where you had the highest concentrations of African Americans in the city of Richmond, which is kind of shown by these turquoise dots there. So fast forward to 1937, we have the Wagner-Steagall Act of 1937. This essentially establishes the public housing program in the United States. So the United States Public Housing Authority, which then obviously places were given the authority to have their own kind of public housing. And so when we look at the development of housing, it was built largely in undesirable locations, frequently at very high densities. So if you're familiar with kind of the history of public housing in Chicago, Cabrini Green is one of the most famous kind of public housing, really tall buildings. I'm from New York, our public housing is really tall. In Richmond, the density isn't so much, but built in undesirable locations, the income requirements and really ensured that only low-income residents would qualify, right? And really work to create concentrations of poverty in certain areas of cities across America. 1944, the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, which is known as the GI Bill, this effectively authorized the Veterans Administration to adopt FHA policies, right? To provide loans to vets based on kind of that racist, discriminatory language that was embedded in FHA's lending policies. Between 1944 and 1971, $95 billion went to vets for home ownership, education, business, unemployment benefits. And specifically with housing, 11 million Americans purchased homes through either FHA or VHA loans. Less than 2% of mortgages went to African Americans, right? Less than 2%. So again, we start to see how literally a federal administration, a federal authority had the ability to limit access to housing opportunity for individuals on the basis of race. Brown v. Board of Education. So obviously it was decided in 1954 that separate public schools for Black and white students was unconstitutional. And so what we saw in a response to the desegregation of schools is something called, two things happening: massive resistance, which is when you literally saw the state or localities closing schools, refusing to integrate and closing schools, and something called white flight. And the impact of white flight is that you had a large concentration of white families, in addition to, middle-class African-American families who essentially fled the cities. And when they left the cities, they took their resources with them. And so what you have left in the cities, like cities of Richmond, is a concentration of, low-income, working-class individuals. You have a draining of resources that are then being put into the suburbs, right? And so leading to the further concentration of poverty in certain areas in the city of Richmond. Federal Highway Act, and this stuff is it's kind of depressing, right? But hopefully when we talk, we can start to kind of grapple with this. And Federal Highway Act of 1956. This essentially, the federal government authorizes $25 billion for the construction of thousands of miles of highway systems throughout the state, as a way to really kind of subsidize the suburbs, right? People needed to be able to get out to their strip malls that they, moved into these suburbs for. And so, unfortunately, these highway systems were built through communities where people lived. And they were often, when folks were on the chopping block to say, whose community does this go through? They were often built through African-American neighborhoods, right? So places where you had individuals who were living, who were thriving. I mean, we hear often, if you're from Richmond and have heard, the Jackson Ward was the Harlem of the South, right? It was a thriving, diverse, socioeconomically diverse African-American community that after intervention, housing was decimated, right? And so thinking about the impacts of that. So a few photos from the mid 50s of communities, and then the impact, what it looked like during this intervention of how the highways being built, right? And I often look at this and I'm like, this is crazy. Homes were here, people lived here, communities were here, right? Black communities were here. And if that was not enough, so I just kind of went through a series of federal policies. Let's not forget that there were also policies being passed on the state level, where state legislators were effectively institutionalizing segregation, racism, and discrimination in housing. So 1911, the city of Richmond city councils, they actually adopt a residential segregation ordinance. In 1912, the state legislature, the Virginia General Assembly, they passed legislation permitting all cities and towns to adopt residential segregation ordinances. 3 years later, in 1915, this was upheld by the Virginia Supreme Court in Hopkins v. the City of Richmond. And it wasn't until 1917 where the US Supreme Court in Buchanan v. Warley ruled that residential segregation ordinances were in fact unconstitutional. And the interesting thing is, when we look at policies, it's also important to understand that it wasn't just the housing policy. It wasn't just housing policies working to perpetuate residential segregation and discrimination in the housing industry. So what I mean by that is the Racial Integrity Act that was passed in the 1920s. Essentially, what it required is that there be a racial description of every person recorded at birth. And it was designed to divide our society. Either you were white or you were colored at the time. And so it expanded the scope of Virginia's interracial ban on marriage, if we know, Virginia v. Loving, but it extended to housing by prohibiting a person from living in a neighborhood where he or she was not permitted to marry any member of the majority population, right? So this is an example how it's not something that is specifically related to housing, but you see the impacts that it has on housing and expanding housing segregation. And then we have things such as racially restrictive covenants, which was explicit language that was written into home deeds that essentially said, this land is never to be sold to a person of a different race that occupies this house, right? And you can, depending on how old your home is and the neighborhoods that you live in, you can find remnants of this language and they are no longer enforceable, obviously, but you can find this language in deeds today. They were outlawed in 1948 in Shelley v. Kramer. So not until almost the 1950s, which is, wild. And so what, right? Like, what is the actual legacy when we're talking about this historical kind of timeline of what housing discrimination has looked like in this country? What's the legacy that we see today? I'll start with public housing in the city of Richmond. For those of you who are not aware, the city has 6 public housing developments. 4 of them are just 1 square mile from each other, located on the city's east end. And when we look at the location of public housing, so public housing in the city of Richmond, I've denoted in these colors, kind of these pinkish colors. If we look at them side by side with a map a redlining map, we see that public housing in this city was literally built in neighborhoods that were previously redlined, right? If we, continue to do the kind of the same dance with looking at poverty and public housing development. So if we look at places in the city that have the highest rates of poverty, we outline that with the location of public housing. We look at the places in the city where you have the largest concentration of children living in poverty. Again, we start to see the pattern that those are the same communities that were impacted by redlining and that would historically have been disinvested in. Race and poverty, right? And we start to see the intersection of kind of the disinvestment, the historical disinvestment, and the impacts on communities of color. So if we look at areas of the city where African Americans are living below the poverty line and Hispanics and Latinos are living below the poverty line, again, we see those highest rates in the West End, in the East End in comparison to this middle map, where toward the West End, areas that were not redlined, lower rates of individuals living in poverty. Same with median household income. Our median household income tends to increase the further you go west in the city of Richmond. Food access, right? So, where I live, I can think, I can go, there's a Publix, there's a Kroger, there's an Aldi, there's all of these options if I wanted to go get food. There are individuals who live in communities in this city where there is a convenience store, but there is no major grocery store. And if you do get to a grocery store, you have to walk more than a mile to get there, right? And if you rely on transit, that is something difficult to do, right? So thinking about, how where we live also impacts food access as well. Foreclosures. So this was a map put together by my predecessor looking at the impact of where foreclosures tend to happen in Richmond and the impact of the foreclosure crisis from 2008. And again, if we, kind of overlay that with the redlining map, we now know that communities, homeowners of color, communities of color were disproportionately impacted by the foreclosure crisis. I won't show this, but this speaks to the same kind of pattern where specifically in the city of Richmond, the rates of African-American home ownership increase, we also saw the rates of foreclosure increase between 2009 and 2012 as well. Tax delinquent parcels, right? Kind of the same trend there. And I think this was from 2017. Pedestrian stops, right? And so, last summer forced many people, I guess, outside of communities of color, right? Because we knew these problems existed, to really reckon with how where we live impacts our relationships with law enforcement and policing. And so this map takes data from RPD pedestrian stops between 2017 and 2018. And we can see that where they are stopping people are in previously redlined communities and communities where there are people, mostly people of color. Just a few more. This kind of shows a national trend of looking at kind of the impacts of residential segregation and police violence. So in 2019, Boston University did a study and they came up with something called the Racism Index. And essentially what they were measuring is kind of the they were looking at how certain factors around educational attainment and neighborhoods and employment impacted or increased the rates of African-American individuals having violent encounters with police. And what they found is that amongst all those factors that they considered in the indices is that residential segregation had the most significant impact on African-American encounters with the police. And so as residential segregation increased, the likelihood of African-Americans having violent encounters with police officers also increased as a part of that racism index, right? And so there you start to see literally the relationship between how where we live impacts the likelihood that our neighborhoods are going to be hyper-policed by law enforcement. And then racial disparities in eviction, right? And so eviction for the city of Richmond, but really Virginia was kind of put in the spotlight after the Matthew Desmond book looking at evictions, and 5 out of the top 10 cities were located in the in the Virginia Commonwealth. And this is a map that our team put together to really look at kind of where evictions, take a neighborhood level look at evictions. And so what we saw is that evictions essentially increased when we saw an increase in the percentage of renter householders that were also African American in the city. And so when we think of measuring segregation, one of the things I've spoken to is this idea of residential segregation. And there are lots of ways to kind of measure it. One of the measurements that I tend to go to is something called the index of dissimilarity. And that is something that is measured on a scale of, like, say 0 to 1. 1 being if a city has a dissimilarity index of 1, that means there is total segregation, right? Like total segregation between, it's a binary, so 2 groups. 0 means complete integration. And so what the value represents is the percentage of residents from one demographic that would have to move, that would have to relocate to another neighborhood to be fully integrated with another group. And so Richmond lands on, and this was from, I think, 2020. So Richmond or 2017 data, Richmond lands at a 0.52 Black-white dissimilarity index, which is not awful, but I think why I end with this is that what it tells you is that this can change, right? That dissimilarity index can change depending on the policies, depending on the efforts put in place to start to kind of remedy a lot of the things that I talked about. And so I'll end with, is housing segregation a matter of discrimination? Not in the pre-housing or the pre-fair housing sense. So when the Fair Housing Act of 1968 was passed, it was passed in response to very explicit acts of redlining, of block busting, of things that were happening in the real estate industry that were kind of over expressions of racism. Unfortunately, what we see today, now that those things have been outlawed, is that overt discrimination rates have fallen dramatically. Now racism is kind of built into the policies and practices of these institutions, which makes it even more difficult to combat, even more difficult to kind of investigate and to really understand how things are happening. And so when we are thinking about, what's the answer to housing segregation and housing discrimination, you're likely not going to see signs that say no Black people can live here, no Hispanic or Latino people can live here. But the important thing is to continue to kind of unpack how these inequities live within our systems and our structures, right? And as I said, that's both in our housing systems, but that's also looking at the intersection of all of these other systems that we exist in, and how they can perpetuate housing discrimination. So I'll end there, and then I'll stop sharing my screen. And if there are thoughts or questions, I would love to open it up and learn more from you all as well. I know that is a lot of information. I'm trying to focus on but it's all important, so.
Thank you. That was so powerful. It's a lot of data and painful to look at, really.
Yeah. It's not, it doesn't give you bubbly feelings at all, but. So what do you all have questions or thoughts? I know you all, I think my understanding of the program, you're coming from different backgrounds. So would really love to hear how kind of housing intersects with the work that you all are doing in your communities and your respective places as well.
Well, I'll talk just, my name's Shirley Helm. I'm from the Wright Center for Clinical and Translational Research. So looking at clinical research participation, diversity, all that kind of thing. And this all enters into it, and really developing relationships with participants, knowing where they're coming from, what their challenges and barriers are. And not only that, but how their living, housing, work environments impact their ability to participate in clinical trials. So I'm not from Richmond. I'm from rural state, New York State. I mean, there's a whole state attached to the city, just for people to know. We pay a lot of taxes to support the city, but that's another. But coming to Richmond, I think this is really important to understand the community in which we live, and understanding in those visuals of like 95 coming down and breaking it. And you kind of hear about it. There's much more discussion of it, such as you're doing, than there ever has been before, which I think is really, really critical for people to understand the community and the people that we all, are our colleagues, coworkers, clients. So thank you for this. This is great.
Yeah, thanks. And I'll send this to Logan, PDF it, and she'll be sending it out to you after.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for your presentation. I believe it was you who did it last year, and it was like so interesting to me. I'm a PhD student in epidemiology, and one of the things I looked at is social epidemiology, and I try to look at the intersections with maternal and child health. And one of my aims for my dissertation project is to look at how residential segregation impacts maternal and child outcomes. So I want to look at how it affects hypertension and how segregation potentially leads to and impacts poverty, which I think you've shown a pretty direct line here of how it does, and how that then subsequently impacts health outcomes. And so I thought that it was very enlightening. I liked the way that you talked about things. And I also appreciated that you talked about some more recent activities that have been going on, especially with the foreclosures and the housing in the 2000s. And that's what I'm trying to think more about, is how more recent policies are compounding the issues that were created previously, and how that is also increasing things like food deserts and the wealth gap that we've heard talked about so much. So I really appreciate that. And I had a question looking at the dissimilarity index, because that's I know that's one of the big measures. How do you think gentrification has impacted the score especially for Richmond?
Yeah, and I thank you for bringing that up. And that's why in the beginning I caveated with, I am hesitant to say, all right, when we talk about segregation and integration in this country, it has always meant people of color moving into white neighborhoods, right? Like physically uprooting ourselves to move into neighborhoods of opportunity. And where I think that is detrimental and that is kind of one-sided is, one, we know that there are communities of color that have existed in this country that were not necessarily racially integrated, but were socioeconomically integrated, and that thrived, right? Like prior to integration. And the second part is that when we do talk about integration as a direct result of integration with white flight, and again, those who could moved out of those neighborhoods, what happened is that you had a draining from those communities of kind of the economic structures that existed. And so I say that to a roundabout way of answering your question. I think that we have to, when we look at patterns of gentrification in the city of Richmond, but what's happening all over the country, we really have to talk about that in conjunction with displacement. Because that also is what's happening, right? Is that studies show that in legacy Black communities, one being Richmond, you have neighborhoods where over the past 10 years, the Black and Brown populations have decreased. And like, you can look at those numbers and say, oh, it's just people choosing to move, right? It's just choice. It's, personal choice if I'm going to move out to the counties. But a lot of that is forced displacement, right? When we think of the serial evictions that are happening, when we think of the serial foreclosures that are happening, compounded, right? This starts to leave communities that have been historically disinvested in, that are now ripe for gentrification. And so I thank you for bringing up that point, because, I think it's policy is great to talk about on the state level and the federal level, as I talked about. But one thing that we know is if localities and, you know, regional entities aren't working together to combat the kind of micro level kind of like housing issues, then, you know, nothing changes as much as we need it to. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I think that's all of those are very valid points, and I agree. And I just I guess because before coming into the program, I was not a very political person. I tried to stay away from politics, but it's like I can't avoid it with the work that I do now. It's really, really central to everything. And I just know when I first realized, because I guess I never thought about it, but just how funding for schools and things are directly impacted by where you live.
Property taxes, yeah.
You know, yeah, it's extremely unfair. It's completely unfair because the communities that need it the most are getting least.
Yep. Yeah.
So thank you.
Thank you, Zashonda.
And you were asking about our intersections with this work. We're launching a history and health program this week, actually, for the first time, looking about the history of MCV, the university, and the health center, and some of the racial inequities that have been a result of that, like grave robbing and just the uncovering of the East Marshall Street well. And one of the things we're incorporating is some online learning modules, and we do have one on housing, history, and health. So I put the link to that in chat, and it was interesting, that map that you showed was like front and center in our online module. So Mariah, if you have any feedback on that, we would love to hear that as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks for sharing this. I'm actually in the fall teaching a health, housing, and equity course at the University of Richmond. So I will be using this as a resource for them.
Excellent. Yes, please. We want, faculty to incorporate this in their classes. Yeah. So cool.
This is great. Perfect. Any other thoughts or questions or?
One I would ask, and I think it's the raising awareness, like things may sound good on the surface, but how do you really pick things apart to understand? Like, it's not my lived experience at all, and there's certain assumptions that I may make, oh, this sounds great, but how do you really pick apart some of these supposed policies or, at the local level, or, as Deshonda said, it's politics. So what questions do you ask? How do you make sure you've done your research or you're asking the right questions in these things? I find that really difficult. And, just having this is raising awareness and the ability to ask questions. But what are those questions?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point, Shirley, because you don't know what you don't know. And I think I'm starting to see it more, but I hope that more institutions, locally, state, federal, start to adopt some requirements around racial impact analysis, so that like once a policy or something is passed or something is legislated, it's like you're kept on the hook for one, in the forefront showing here can be the potential impacts of this, but on the back end saying like here are the racial the implications for the impact that this has on different communities. But I do think it's hard to know kind of which questions to ask, because when you look at kind of how the processes of gentrification happen and displacement, they happen over time. And like it's like you'll look up 10 years and you're like, this community, so I'm from Harlem. And when I go back to Harlem, I don't even know what Harlem looks like in New York because it's so different. We always joke there's where the Apollo is on 125th Street. When Whole Foods came, it was like, well, there goes the neighborhood, right? So you have these signs, but it's not until like a decade later where you're like, wow, these legislators really did a number on this community, and it's hard to know how to get involved and the right questions to ask. And I'm still learning that too. So,
and I think part of it is it's very intentional what's being done on many levels. I mean, it's like planning and all of that. But I would also say that a lot of this needs to be, health and history, I think is great. And quite frankly, I think that should be required of anybody who works within the system, VCU. But having this brought into and I know it's a far reach, public education, but reteaching what history really is. I mean, my dad went on the GI Bill. He was rural, got his college education. That worked for him. But, there's the other side to it too. And I don't know what the answer is. It's discouraging,
I agree,
but thank
Shirley. Yep. We have a few more minutes. So any last thoughts?
I just had one comment, and I just wanted to thank you for your presentation, but also Deshonda, I wanted to thank you for asking a question that has been on my mind personally for years. I am in university relations, but frankly, I'm looking to this presentation kind of just for some self-education, because I am fairly new to Richmond. I moved here about a year and a half ago. And one of the things that has been on my mind ever since the day I moved here has been trying to figure out where is, I suppose, the most ethical place for someone to live, recognizing the factors of gentrification on communities of color that have historically lived in certain neighborhoods, and recognizing that, if I were to one day want to own a home, if I were to move into that neighborhood, would that result in possibly, the rents changing, evictions changing, foreclosures? And so some of the data that you've presented, Mariah, in this presentation really is really helpful, just to kind of contextualize that for me, but also just in general, I think it's something that can get lost on people who aren't paying attention. That there are so many different factors in basically determining where people can and can't live. And I want to say I really appreciate you walking us through all of this. And I had one question, and that's mostly related to public schooling. I'm a little curious about that. So have there been any models in other cities that perhaps Richmond could consider following, related to educational funding? Because it sounds like that is kind of a core part of, both, and correct me if I'm misunderstanding this, but it sounds like to some degree, both public education funding is coming from property taxes, but also I remember listening to my sister talking about, oh, well, we're moving to this neighborhood in suburban Chicago because it has great schools, which means excellent property values for me and my husband. So it's something I've been really curious about. Are there any models that Richmond could consider following related to educational funding that might make things more equitable?
I don't know specifically, but I know there, and this always comes up at the General Assembly, is creating so funding comes from property taxes in addition to from the state as well. And so I know there has been conversation with literally kind of changing that calculation so that schools aren't funded based on, some of the things you speak to. I don't know models, and I would have to look nationally on more equitable ways for schools to be funded. I will say, outside of the funding piece, so for example, it is because we know that the quality of schools becomes a proxy for people deciding to move to a neighborhood or not, like mentioning school performance and things like that. I believe it's illegal under the fair housing, right? Because if someone asks, like, how's the school in this area? I mean, you can look at the rating systems, but as a realtor, not necessarily, when we train them and work with them, we encourage them not to say, well, the school's really good in this neighborhood, because the family will then automatically shift to, okay, well, if the school's good, then this is good, then this is good as well. But on the funding piece, I am not quite sure. I would have to do more research on more equitable kind of funding models. I did want to, and I know we only have a minute, but I did want to speak to something that resonated with what you said about the physical displacement and thinking, intentionally about where you move. And I think that's a hard decision, right? But I do think one of the things that happens in addition to when we talk about gentrification and physical displacement is the social and cultural displacement that happens, right? And so what I mean by that is, like, you could be someone who moves to a community, right? And you could maybe be well-intentioned, right? And so maybe you couldn't help moving to that community. But one of the things that, you know, starts to happen is like when people move into communities that they don't have context about, is like, you know, someone could be hanging on their stoop. And that's something they've been doing for years and years. But all of a sudden you move in and you think it's noisy. So you do something like call the police, right? And I think it's still, and that sounds like, you know, but people do that, right? And so when we talk about the displacement, yeah, it's physical, but it's also social and cultural, right? And so I think to be a good human and to move into communities, it's also being conscious of saying like, what existed? How did people exist here before I moved here? And how can I come in and instead of changing that, fold into this, embrace this as well? Does that make sense?
It really does, and I really appreciate you speaking to that, because it is something that has consumed my thoughts for the entire 18 months that I have lived here, is trying to figure out how I can, you know, be wherever I'm living, I can, you know, contribute to the history of the community and to the, you know, the social and cultural, you know, basically the way things have been in a neighborhood wherever I move. So I really appreciate you speaking to that. Thank you.
Of course. And we are up on time. Roy, I shared my email with you, but I'll also include it. Logan, feel free to share my information. I love connecting on these things, like for real. So if you have additional questions or, you know, want to talk about this more, then would love to chat. So please feel free to reach out.